When people start to learn about translation, the basic question is, how do I translate? And there's not really a simple answer to that question, which is why translation is worth studying. We can, however, present a few models, which are simplifications of what is inherently a very complex process. Now, the first model I want to present, of three that are on offer here, concerns a linguistic approach to translation. And I take here a classic example from some French linguists, Vinet and Dabelnet, I think from 1958, very, very old example. ST, start text or source text. The ink is on the table, which conveniently, if you're working into French, is word for word. Article, noun, verb, preposition, article, noun. Okay, l'encre sur la table, the ink is on the table, no problem. As long as every language matches up like that, you can do what's called literal translation, which is just staying as close as possible to the text. And remarkably, if you're going into Chinese, you can do much the same thing, because Chinese is a subject-verb-object language, like English and like French. However, here, notice that the preposition shang is at the end of the sentence and is displaced. So we could say, according to this way of thinking, translators work like dictionaries, looking up each word. So you've got a dictionary in your head, and you get all the lexical items. And then, if necessary, you do a syntactic transformation, moving things around in the sentence. So it would be lexical replacement plus syntactic transformation, and that's everything about translating, perhaps. Okay? Here's another example of the same thing. ST, I like it. Very simple. Okay? Subject, verb, object. But what happens when you go into, for example, Spanish? Me gusta means to me, it, but the subject is absent, pleases or is pleasing. Me gusta, very simple to say, but the transformations, the grammatical transformations, are quite extreme. Interestingly enough, French, ça me plaît, is the same, and German, es gefällt mir, is similar, except German has another transformation there, because it likes to have the verb in second position. However, we could continue to believe in linguistic transformations explaining all of these examples. Interestingly, Chinese, Wo Xuan is the same as English. So do not believe that Chinese is absolutely exotic. And if you're Chinese or Asian, do not believe that all European languages are the same. They aren't. And that's why we have translators. Now, let me take that same example and put it into a situation. Here's a situation. Help! The ink's on the table. Now, we can translate that exactly the same way. L'encre sur la table, no problem. But we could also say, for example, hay tinta sobre la mesa. There's ink on the table, exclamation mark. What does that mean? It means implicitly, the ink has spilled, or clean up the ink from the table. And all those things could be said in that situation if the purpose is to alert the addressee, the receiver, the second person, about the need to clean up the ink. So we can say, saca la tinta de la mesa, clean up the ink from the table, as a translation of the ink is on the table. Is that a linguistic operation? Not really. It's putting that sentence into a situation where there's a purpose, something that has to be achieved, and we say what is needed in order to achieve the purpose. So the translator's mind is thinking in terms of what some analyses call scenes and frames, but we could just say a situation and a function. So very broadly, this would be a functionalist approach to translation as opposed to the previous linguistic approach. Some of you will be thinking that the linguistic approach means literalism and the functionalist approach means free translation. I don't like those oppositions. I don't think it's just two ways of translating. And hey, it's not really free because you've got to say things in order to fulfill that function. So if there is freedom, it's because you can select between alternatives. But there is not one translation method or strategy or approach called free translation. And we'll come to that later in the course. Okay? Now, to help us think about this opposition between linguistic and functionalist approaches, consider this. This is from a musical called Annie Get Your Gun, and it's a song, a duet, which goes, anything you can say, I can say better. Then the man says, I can say anything better than you. No, you can't. Yes, you can. All right. Okay. Anything you can say can be said better. I can say anything better than you. I can improve on anything you say. Whatever you say can be made better by me. My version of what you say is always better, and improvements are inevitable when I say what you say. And so on. Okay? I'm simply better than you at saying things. This is called reformulation. You take a sentence and you say it in a different way. And this can be done within the SL, the start language. And it's a good trick because sometimes you're stuck and you say, I don't know how to translate this. This is untranslatable, impossible. But if you go back to the ST and you use reformulation, you can work on it sometimes until you get a sentence that you can translate easily. So it's a good trick that translators use. Interestingly, it's applying the functionalist approach to produce linguistic transformations. Okay, so the two approaches really are not that separate, or the two models, if you like, are not too different. I'm calling this a principle of effability. Effability sounds rude, but it's not rude. Effability is the principle that anything can be said differently in the same language. That would be intralingual effability, and interlingual, between languages, anything can be said in another language. If you like, effability, if it's interlingual, means translatability. It doesn't say the translation will be easy. It doesn't say it will have the same number of words. You might require a whole page or a whole book to explain the translation and get the message across. And it doesn't say that the translation is going to work here and now. It might take 10 years of linguistic work on a language in order to get the thing expressed. The principle of effability just says it's possible. It's possible, okay? Not here and now, and not in as many words. It may take a lot of work, but it's possible. Now, which of these two models is correct? As you've already guessed, I think neither of them really encompasses the full range of what translators do. If, however, you've translated the ink is on the table, and your next translation is the pen is on the table, I take a very simple example here. Hey, you're going to think linguistically. You're going to replace ink with pen, and that's your translation. Okay? We'll see that translation memories actually do this. So they're working linguistically on that model, and they get you to think linguistically on that model. If, however, I've got the ink is on the table and my function, my purpose is to say, clean up the ink, then you're not thinking linguistically, you're thinking functionally, and machine translation can sometimes do that. And that's what we're going to test very soon. Because my third model, ladies and gentlemen, my third model between the, or in addition to the linguistic and the functional model is a technology model. Because these days, hey, we have free online machine translation, and what you can do is put the ST into something like DeepL, not for all languages, or Google Translate, or Microsoft Translator, or Youdao, or Baidu, and many of these free online machine translation systems, and you get a translation. You may have to repair it, that is, correct it, which we're going to call post-editing. But what I'm interested in here is showing that the two other models come together here, okay? This we might think has been generated linguistically. It's not actually true. It's been generated mathematically. And then we have the possibility of selecting between these alternatives. How do you know which of these to select? What, the first one because you trust the machine? Perhaps. But it might also be, given the situation, I think functionally I will trust this one or this one or this one. Okay? I'll do the same thing in Spanish. If you bring up that in Spanish, you get La tinta está sobre la mesa, word for word literalism. But you can then click on each of these in DeepL and get a whole list of alternatives. Está en la mesa, and so on. And then you have to select which of those alternatives is the most convenient, the most appropriate for the function to be fulfilled in the text and therefore in the situation. So what's interesting, if we take this third model, work from machine translation, which is what we're going to be doing in class, I think if you think about it critically and look into what you're actually doing, you'll find that there is a combination of the linguistic approach and the functional approach. And the two are really quite difficult to separate. There you have it. How do you translate? Well, there you have 3 ways of translating.